So, automation is nothing new. We're hearing AI being talked about in so many different ways. There's always a new AI headline every single month that seems to break the Twitter and the technology internet in some way, shape, or form. So, that's nothing new. However, the application of automation and the application, how it's used, can really, it is, will never ever not be impactful. Always, there are always going to be interesting ways where it's where AI is being utilized. And for me, first place it happened for me, and for first time it happened for me was when I worked at Gartner, and we didn't even implement anything that was extremely technical. It was a software tool, a software as a service tool called SalesLoft. And with this tool, it was supposed to automate a lot of the prospecting activity that we would do. So as a sales executive, a lot of my day to day was in, sending out emails, sending out LinkedIn messages, a lot of outreach prospecting activity. And what was really unique about SalesLoft is you can automate so much of this process where I didn't have to click the button multiple times to send multiple emails. I had to click a button once and it would start a cadence of emails being sent to into all of my prospects, everyone in my territory that I wanted to stay engaged with. So that was my first enterprise case study of how automation can be very powerful. It helped me in my day to day, and of course, it helped dozens of other sales executives in the Asia Pacific region, Europe, and obviously the United States, where my direct team was based. So automation, AI is here to stay. And however, what surprised me about working at Gartner was how much opportunity there is to automate and not to. Sometimes I look at headlines and I assume that every company is the most AI enabled, or they have all of these automation sequences and implementation, all these automation strategies and roadmaps in place, when that is not the case at all. And so with that being said, because there's so much of an emphasis on automation and a growth in I thought to myself, this is definitely an opportunity for me to learn how it's being implemented at the enterprise, because automation and AI still has a long road ahead of itself. And I'm excited to kind of learn a bit more about what that road looks like, what different tools are available to do that. So we're going to start off simple. What we're going to do is create a virtual machine, but using a Python script instead of going through the graphical user interface and clicking around and doing it that way. So now we're going to switch from my phone over to my laptop computer and get started. Okay, so now we are in Azure, specifically in the virtual machines menu. And in a previous video, I created this virtual machine here, create VM. I already have it running, so that way we can, don't have to wait too long to access this virtual machine via SSH. And like I mentioned, what we're going to do here is we're going to use a bash script to automate the creation of a virtual machine, because for this virtual machine, create VM, what we did here is we clicked create, we used the graphical user interface, we went in here and we selected the different parameters that we wanted for this virtual machine. And the difference between clicking through these different tabs here and going through this creation wizard to create the virtual machine, instead of doing that, I'm going to show how quickly you can create a virtual machine with a simple script. So what we're going to do first is we're actually going to go into our virtual machine and connect to it and create a new virtual machine using our virtual machine. A bit trippy, at least for me, whenever I think about it, but it's pretty cool in the context of automation. And so the first step we're going to do here is connect to it by clicking connect. I'm going to use the Azure command line interface. However, if I wanted to, I could connect through, connect right from my MacBook computer through its terminal, but I'm going to click select to do so from the Azure CLI. And right now it is validating the access through, with the SSH login that we have configured we've configured here in Azure to conveniently connect to this virtual machine with the SSH keys. So at this point we are in, so very quick and easy to do since we didn't have to spend any time waiting for the virtual machine to start running. Now that we're in a virtual machine, we need to go ahead and create the script and run the script to launch our virtual machines. So what I've done here is create instructions, write the script already to be run in our virtual machine. And I'm going to walk through some of the different sections that I have here very briefly, just to understand the approach and how we're going to accomplish this task here of creating a virtual machine using code. So the first note I have here is to make sure to run this command chmod +x filename.sh. What I'm doing here is I'm setting the permissions for this file that I'm going to create, specifically the executable permission. A best practice, and in theory, if someone else was going to be using this file, this script file, I want them to understand that this is meant to be executed. It's meant to be run, not just to be viewed by a person who encounters this script. So here I'm just making a note to myself to add that, to add that permission once the file is created. But to create the file, we need to open a text editor and create a new shell script ending in .sh by copying and pasting the text below, starting from install Azure CLI all the way down to save script by pressing Control O. So install Azure CLI here, all the way down to save script by pressing Control plus O. But before we go ahead and create the script, let's go and walk through the script to see what's going on here. So the first thing I do here is I ensure that the Azure install Azure CLI is I ensure that the Azure CLI is installed. So this is going to be important so that our machine knows these different Azure commands that we're going to be using. So that's really important to make sure that it's installed. And because if it's not installed, then it won't recognize these commands here, specifically these AZ commands. After we've confirmed and that the Azure CLI is installed, the next thing is we're going to define variables here. And variables it's essentially a placeholder for something else. So for example, subscription ID is our variable, and what we put as in the subscription ID is the actual subscription ID that we want to work with, which is a series of letters and numbers. But instead of having to copy and paste and reuse the series of letters and numbers, we're just gonna type subscription ID and use that throughout our code. And you'll see that as we move along here. And I've set a resource group variable, the name of the virtual machine, location, availability zone, etc. In the case of an admin username, this variable, it needs to make sure that it's all in lowercase with no special characters. We're all good here. So these are some variables that are defined that will be used and called on with different lines of code here. So now that we've defined our variables, the next thing that we want to do is create the network security group. It's very important for security and making sure that we have secure access to our virtual machine. I use the command az network nsg create. We specify the resource group, the name of the network security group, the location of the network security group, all already defined in variables that we are using here. Next, we need to create an NSG rule to allow SSH access via port 22. We use the command az network NSG rule create, and we create the resource group. We have we create the NSG rule by specifying various parameters like the resource group, like the name of the network security group, and then some of the items here we didn't specify as a variable, but nevertheless we can write it out. The name of our rule, allow SSH protocol TCP. Priority is not as important because we only have 2 rules here, but nevertheless I did make this a more of a priority versus this other rule that we'll get to momentarily. Port 22, allowing the source addresses to be anywhere as long as it's through port 22, and of course you need that SSH key to access this virtual machine. So although it does allow inbound access from anywhere, because it is via SSH and through an SSH key, to make sure that it's secure access and not just anyone can access our virtual machine. The other rule that I have here is to allow inbound traffic from our virtual network. So for instance, on the subject of SSH keys, in the creation of our virtual machine, to skip very briefly, I'm going to be generating SSH keys. So I'm going to be creating new SSH keys. A question that I have, and a question that is relevant for this task, is where are those SSH keys going to be hosted and kept if we wanted to use this virtual machine again, and it wasn't just for the sake of this lab? Well, in the case of Azure, they have a key vault service where you can store different secrets and credentials and sensitive information for secure access to different services like your virtual machine through SSH. And you can keep those keys in a key vault. That way, when a script is being run, Azure Key Vault can be referenced to securely retrieve different credentials needed for running that script. In this case, we're not using an existing script. We're generating new SSH keys, but this rule will be important for us to build on the topic of SSH keys, to build on the topic of secure access to our virtual machine through SSH keys that are being reused. And of course, in this line, we can actually specify the name of the keys if we wanted to, instead of generating a new SSH keys. But of course, thinking about security, thinking about who, ensuring that those keys are only seen by the person by whoever is authorized to use those keys. A key vault service is going to be really, really helpful here. That way, that key vault is authorized to use those keys and not just anybody. That's what this rule is for, whether it be the key vault service or any other service or resource in our virtual network. We trust our virtual network. It's a trusted network, so we want to ensure that there's access to that we allow traffic from our virtual network to the virtual machine. Now that our network security group has been created, our rules have been configured, next we will move on to the creation of the virtual machine. Just like in the graphical user interface, we're going to define the subscription, the resource group, the name of the virtual machine, the location that we want our virtual machine to be deployed, and many other parameters that you see here, many of which were specified as a variable. And once we have all of that configured here in each line, we'll be good to go. We can save the script. Okay, so I've cleared the terminal just so we have a bit more space here and less text to look at. But let's go ahead and follow the instructions as we've reviewed them to create our script. So first things first, I'm going to open text editor by creating a new shell script file ending in .sh. So we have nano create VM CLI.sh. I'm going to copy this and paste it here. Hit enter. Now we're in our text editor, and we can add all of the code that we have talked through that includes all of the variables and the parameters to deploy our virtual machine. So we're going to begin here with this comment, install Azure CLI, and we're going to keep going all the way until we get to the bottom here. Save script by pressing Control plus O, then enter Control plus X. I'm going to copy that over to the terminal, paste this, and save script by pressing Control O, enter Control X. So now we have our script file with the code that we have set for the creation of our virtual machine. Make the script executable. chmod plus x create VM CLI.sh. I'm going to paste that here and hit enter. And then lastly, for the fun part, we're going to run the script file that we've created. So although we have created this script file, anyone else in the future, or even in the future, if we wanted to create a virtual machine like this, all we would need to do is make sure we have the script file saved conveniently in some sort of repository, and we would run the script as follows to create a virtual machine. So let's go ahead and hit enter. And the first thing that's happening is it's installing the Azure CLI, and if you saw, there was a message here showing that it was already installed and there wasn't any upgrades or any updates, which is fine. And so now that it's gone through that line, and so that line that I'm referring to is installing this Azure CLI here. So now it's just, now that the virtual machine is created, it is running and getting started here. And so we're also seeing our NSG rules being provisioned as well. Looks like we have some other all outbound traffic. These look like some generic default rules in our NSG. But everything looks smooth. It looks like everything is running as expected in the deployment of our virtual machine, and also seeing here that all of our NSG rules, in addition to some default ones, have also been created. So it's going to take a moment here for this to actually confirm. So let's go ahead and wait a few moments, and here we are. It looks like the virtual machine is created. We have the location, it says the power state it's running. We have the resource group that it's in, and the public IP address as well. And if we were to minimize this window, and right here in our graphical user interface, if we went to virtual machines, and I'm going to refresh my screen here, we have our virtual machine created, create VM CLI. It's running. We see the public IP address and we see the time that it was created just about 2 minutes ago. Everything looks smooth. Everything looks fine. And then we can also confirm that the network security group, let's see here, network settings. Here we are, the network security group that we created, create VM CLI _NSG. It's also here as well. And if we were to go into this NSG, we have our rules. So we have this rule here to allow SSH, and then also this rule here to allow VNet inbound. Both of these rules are what we created, in addition to some of these other default rules that were created by Azure automatically when creating the virtual machine. So now, not only have we created a virtual machine in Azure using the graphical user interface, we've also automated the creation and deployment of our virtual machine using a bash script.